Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the online CME webinar on genomic applications in cancer. Today's topic is molecular pathology of lung cancer, and our speaker is Dr. Siddharth Srivastav. I'm Dr. Nirmala Sirisena, Senior Lecturer and Clinical Geneticist at the Human Genetics Unit, Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. Dr. Siddharth is the Chief Scientist in Molecular Oncology at the Newburgh Center for Genomic Medicine, Ahmedabad, India. He is experienced in molecular aspects of cancers, cardiovascular diseases, bacterial and dengue pathogenesis. Prior to Newburgh Genetic Diagnostics, he worked at Global Vaccines Incorporated in North Carolina, the McAllister Heart Institute, and at the School of Medicine, University of North Carolina, from which he has several publications. At the Newburgh Center of Genomic Medicine, he performs molecular pathology on solid tumors. He's also passionate about molecular oncology education. So before we begin today's webinar, few housekeeping rules. I would like to kindly request all the participants to keep their videos switched off and mics muted. At the end of Dr. Siddharth's presentation, the floor will be open for questions and comments. So over to you, Dr. Siddharth.
Thank you so much. I would like to really say thanks to Dr. Nirmala Sirisena. We had met at Hyderabad some time back, and after that we had kept kept connect, and eventually fruitioned into this webinar. And I'm really happy that for this generous invite by Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo, and Society of Genetics. So today we'll discuss about molecular pathology of non-small cell lung carcinoma, and because it's a very mixed audience, so wherever required, I'll fill in the details of what about if there is any clinical detail. Um, but feel free to ask questions in between also. But I'll try to finish everything within 30 minutes, so we have a full 15 minutes of time where we can do Q&A session. Um, so, uh, so let's briefly talk about how molecular medicine has really changed or is changing the way clinicians are practicing medicine. For example, in this slide, you can see that on the left panel, you can see that when a patient comes in, a lot of examination happens for this cancer patient, blood analysis, um, CT, PET CTs, imaging, histopathology. And nowadays, even for diagnosis, at a lot of different places, already genomics have come into picture. Um, so right from the very beginning, molecular methods have stepped in the patient care, the cancer patient care. And after that, even during the treatment part, so in the initial phase of treatment where radiation therapy, chemotherapy, and surgery are practiced, targeted therapies have also come in certain cancers, such as lung cancer. And later on, when the disease metastasizes, if and when disease metastasizes, again, for as part of systemic therapy, apart from chemotherapy, targeted therapies play a pivotal role. Now, if we talk about how exactly it is practiced in everyday life, that has also changed. So earlier, histopathologists and medical oncologists, they used to interact as well as radiation oncologists, surgical oncologists. But now a new entity has added, which is the molecular pathologist. So usually, what these people do is they take the reports from medical oncologists and histopathologists to get a fair idea about the clinical history of the patient and what the pathology says. And then they would overlap it on their own molecular algorithms, like, to determine which genes should be tested for a specific kind of cancer, let's say lung cancer, at what stage it is, etc. And based on that molecular algorithm, then they will suggest the doctor that, okay, why don't you go for, testing these genes and these exons and these mutations which are critical. And once the doctor is also on board, then the sample is procured, which is, often either the FFP block, these are the tumor tissues which are fixed in formalin and then made a paraffin block out of it. So either those, sometimes even fresh tissue, many times blood. So different kind of samples, they arrive to molecular pathologists, and that's how the report is generated. And based on that, the patient care also changes, the patient management changes. So this is how I'm just giving a brief overview as to how uh, molecular biology is changing the clinical practice of cancer. Now, how it all, how this all happened. So this is not something which happened in a very short period of time. Of course, everything which comes to clinic always starts from universities or institutes. So a lot of basic and clinical research happened, where oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes and a lot of these mechanisms which lead to tumor formation, they were all elucidated in these basic science laboratories. So while everybody knows about human genome sequencing that happened in early 2000, what people do not know a lot is, after human genome sequencing, a much bigger project of cancer genome sequencing happened. And for example, as part of that cancer genome sequencing, there was the Cancer Genome Atlas and the International Cancer Genome Consortium. They basically built landscapes of the mutation landscapes of various different cancers. So let's say you have breast cancer. So they will take, like, 500 patients of a specific type of breast cancer, and they'll sequence the whole genome sequence, the transcriptomes, RNA sequences, everything would be sequenced and then uh, documented, and it would be made available to anybody who wants to use it, thanks to the Cancer Genome Atlas. So all that data is made available. So all these landscapes, or maps, or mutational maps are created by the Cancer Genome Atlas and ICGC, and very generously made available to entire world. So this gave the first glimpse of how these cancer tumors look like at a molecular level. At a by radiology, you can see these tumors, you can cut these tumors, you can actually do histopathology. But at the molecular level, at the gene level, how it looks like, that was all because of these efforts in the basic science laboratories. And then the second thing that happened, and that really helped bring the sequencing techniques in clinic, was the sequencing itself became cheaper over the years. So you can see here, there is a graph that is shown, which is cost per genome, and there is a white line that says Moore's law. So what Moore's law says is that the number of transistors on any chip doubles every year, while the cost of computing halves every year, right? So this really powered this computer revolution. Every time you will see that your phone chips are becoming smaller and smaller. So that's all thanks to Moore's law. But if you compare that with the cost of sequencing, it beats Moore's law hands down. So what it tells us that, the cost, the sudden drop in the cost of sequencing is going to catapult this entire clinical genomics and genomics into a sphere where it will be accessible to common men, to clinic, etc., which is what is happening. Now, the third player in this whole in this whole picture was the drug companies. So when drug companies got to know that, okay, these are the mutational landscapes, and because of these, certain proteins are getting transformed, which are leading to cancer tumor formation. So they started devising blockers, and which became the drugs. So now you had perfect combination. You had You had the mutational landscapes, you had the diagnostic tools, and they became cheaper enough that it could come to the clinic. And then you had also drugs. So this was perfect for a for an oncologist to now start practicing molecular medicine to manage the patient. So this is how it all came down all the way to the clinic. Now, if you see the timeline of lung adenocarcinoma and what major things happened was one of the major things happened was in 2009 when one of the drugs, one of the inhibitors of EGFR. EGFR is one of the oncogenes or oncoprotein. So gefitinib actually binds and blocks EGFR, and it showed a better activity than the chemotherapy. So if you see the graph on the lower right side, it says progression-free survival. So if you take metastatic cancer patients in advanced stages, and if you treat them with standard chemotherapy versus if you treat them with gefitinib, you can see that there is almost a difference of almost 12 months, right? So progression free survival in case of gefitinib was about 10 months, whereas in case of standard chemotherapy, it was barely 5 months. So that actually brought targeted therapies into fore. And for example, in lung carcinoma, if the patient is metastatic and advanced, then targeted therapy is preferred over chemotherapy. So the advances kept happening, and in 2014, like EGFR was one of the first molecules that was targeted in cancer patients, in lung cancer patients. In 2014, there was another molecule called ALK, and that was targeted by crizotinib. And then 2017, then there is osimertinib, which is the second generation of tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So all it says is that over a period of time, there is a lot of research now happening in finding newer and newer targets uh, for lung cancer and newer drugs for lung cancer, which are targeted therapies, right? So this is a brief timeline as to how lung cancer management is changing and what all new molecules are coming up. And nowadays, if you see FDA's website, every now and then you will find a new cancer targeted therapy getting approved, immunotherapy is getting approved. So let's say we take, let's go about understanding how genetic medicine is changing the face of managing lung cancer by taking one of the examples. So let's say a 45-year-old man with no history of tobacco, he complained for months, cough and lower back pain, and there was a shortness of breath. And one of the telltale sign that 11.5, 11.3 kg weight was lost. And when the doctor requested for CT scan and CT guided needle biopsy, it came out very conclusive that one could see these nodules, which are tumors, and the biopsy was sent for histopathology. So one is like they do hematoxylin eosin staining, by which they can see the atypical cells, and one can tell that okay, this is adenocarcinoma or squamous cell carcinoma, and if there is any confusion, then further IHC panels or his immunohistochemistry panels are run. For example, the first thing first is TTF1 P40. So these are two markers, and if the panel comes if the tissue comes positive for TTF1, whereas negative for P40, so it classifies into adenocarcinoma. So adenocarcinomas are nothing but cancers that which are evolved from liquid secreting cells, for example mucus secreting cells in the lungs. So these are called as adenocarcinoma, whereas squamous cell carcinomas are originating from the inner lining, which make the inner wall of the airways of the lungs. So if the tumor comes out of those, then they are called as squamous cell carcinoma. So let's say this was an adenocarcinoma. So what doctor does is, since this patient was advanced and it was already metastatic, so this NCCN or National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines are the very standard guidelines which oncologists usually follow. So one of the things that you will see here is that the columns under the testing part. So what they are advising to test. One, they are saying, okay, EGFR mutation testing, category 1, meaning like these are the first level category that you need to do this, right? ALK testing, category 1, ROS testing, BRAF testing, MET exon 14 skipping testing, RET testing, and then you also need to do PDL1 testing. And based on what you get as positive, then that's a testing result. So let's say it's a sensitizing EGFR mutation positive. Then if you click on NSLC19, so it will go to a page where it will show how to manage a patient who is lung carcinoma, but who has hello, yeah, so who has lung adenocarcinoma, but who has EGFR mutation. Whereas the management of a patient who is again a lung adenocarcinoma, but who is ALK positive, the management, the drugs, etc., completely change. So this is how targeted therapy is very different than cytotoxic chemotherapy. That you need to figure out what is your target, and based on that, your therapies, your management, everything changes a lot, right? So in this, so how so this is how a medical oncologist sees that. Okay, these are the things that I need to test. But a molecular pathologist, the same information he sees, or he or she sees in a very different way. So, this is from KEGG Pathways. KEGG Pathways is published by a Japanese institution, Kyoto University. So if you see this image, on the left side, you have the non-small cell lung cancer and the stages. So let's say it says alveolar and broncholar epithelial cells, and then it advances to atypical adenomatous hyperplasia, then advances to primary adenocarcinoma. So this is the y-axis, right? And if you compare it on the right side, you will see that between atypical adenomatous hyperplasia to primary adenocarcinoma, you will see that EGFR gets mutated, right? It is in the red, or like EML4 ALK mutation happens. That is also in red. So on the x-axis, you see what are the molecular events that happen versus when the with the pathologic event that is happening on the y-axis, right? So this part is the outside the cell part. Then these two lines, they represent the cell membrane, and EGFR is epidermal growth factor receptor. So that is an integral receptor which is bound within the membrane, but it has an extracellular domain. So a small part of it jets out of the cell, and then it has an intracellular domain. So a small part of it is jetting inside the cell, and it has a transmembrane domain. So these are like you know tyrosine kinase receptors, right? And these receptors are important because when a growth factor binds to these receptors. So for example, EGFR, epidermal growth factor, its ligand could be EGF, epidermal growth factor, or TGF alpha. So there are about 6 ligands for EGFR. They can bind onto EGFR, and then they can stimulate the EGFR. And what EGFR does is that it takes the stimulation of a growth factor from outside, from the extracellular domain, and transmits it to the intracellular domain. And this signal is then passed on to, let's say, this axis: GRB2, SOS, RAS, RAF, MEK, ERK, and then ERK. So this all is in cytoplasm. This is one single cell within the lung tissue. And then this ERK is a transcriptional activator. So it goes inside the nucleus, and within nucleus it causes increased expression of cyclin D1, which results in the proliferation. And when the cell proliferates uncontrollably, then it will cause cancer, right? It will result in tumor. So this is just a very brief thing about what we are talking about. So like when we talk about EGFR mutation testing, so why we are trying to test the EGFR? Because it can lead eventually to excessive signaling and can lead to tumor formation. So in this particular patient, when we tested the genes, the oncogenes, we found that there was a mutation in EGFR gene, which is epidermal growth factor receptor, And then this is the mutation which is described in the cDNA. It is from 2235 uh, to 2249. So there is a deletion, right? Excuse me. So there is a deletion of about 15 nucleotides. So GGA, ATT, AAG, AGA, AGC. So 15 nucleotides, and 3 nucleotides make a codon. So it makes one amino acid. So 15 nucleotides meaning you're talking about 5 amino acids, right? So there is a deletion of, at the protein level, there is a deletion of 5 amino acids between 746 to 750 position, right? And what people already know is that when this mutation happens, then this EGFR, which is a tyrosine kinase, it becomes active all the time. So if you see here, uh, sorry, if you see here, when EGFR gets activated, it passes on the phosphorylation signal to GRB2, SOS, RAS, RAF, MEK, ERK, and then eventually it leads to proliferation. But that happens only when the ligand of EGFR binds to it. When the growth factor of EGFR binds to it, only then it becomes active. But what if EGFR becomes active constitutively, like it becomes active without even a growth factor binding to it? Then it will continuously signal through GRB2 and all this, the entire signaling pathway, and the proliferation will keep on. So cell will keep on dividing, without even any growth signal, and that will lead to the tumor formation, right? So in this case, it was already known that this mutation, this particular mutation, which is a deletion of 5 amino acids between 746 to 750 position, it is already known to make EGFR constitutively active, so that it doesn't require binding of EGF to get active, right? So it continuously fires the signaling pathway and causes the cell to multiply, right? So this is how it happens. You have this EGFR molecule, and a part of it is the transmembrane domain. This is the intracellular domain, and this is the extracellular domain. And when EGF or TGF alpha or any of its ligand binds, so basically two such receptors, they dimerize, and once they dimerize, the intracellular domain has a tyrosine kinase domain, right? So tyrosine kinase is the enzyme that transfers a phosphate group, or it phosphorylates another amino acid. So those kind of enzymes are called as kinases. So there is a there is a kinase which finds a tyrosine residue on its own, on the intracellular domain, and phosphorylates it. That's why it is called as tyrosine kinase domain. And once that happens, it activates, right? So this is in the picture A. You will see that in the purple EGFR, once it gets phosphorylated, then GRB2 protein binds to this phosphorylated tyrosine, and then that activates SOS protein, and the SOS protein gives one more phosphate to the GDP binding to RAS, so it becomes a GTP, and then the RAS phosphorylates RAF, RAF or phosphorylates MEK to ERK. ERK is a transcriptional activator that goes inside the cell, and then it binds on the DNA within the nucleus, and causes expression of cyclin D1. Cyclin D1 then binds to CDK4, CDK6, and that starts the cell cycle, and the proliferation of the cell happens. So, what really, how really this particular mutation makes EGFR constitutively active. So, if you see the structure of EGFR, it has two lobes. One is an N lobe, and the second one is a C lobe. And and in the N lobe there is an alpha C domain. This alpha C domain, it basically protrudes, or it rotates out, and that makes this protein inactive. And these two amino acids at the 745, K745 and E762, they cannot interact with each other. Now in the and between the N lobe and the C lobe there is this ATP binding socket, right? Now what happens is, when there is an exon 19 deletion, which was the mutation that happened in our patient's tumor, then this beta 3 alpha C loop is shortened. So this alpha C domain is it retracts inside, right? So it is not rotated outside, it retracts inside. And this 762 and 745, these two amino acids can interact with each other, and it will allow the ATP to bind here, right? And once the ATP bind, then that phosphate group of ATP is utilized to phosphorylate the tyrosine residue. So this is how, once you have an exon 19 deletion, so it is continuously in the active conformation. It is no longer in the inactive conformation. And once EGFR is continuously in the active conformation, it will keep on firing this MAP kinase signaling pathway, and it will keep on causing the proliferation of the cell. So now what doctor did was that they gave the patient gefitinib. Now this gefitinib basically binds to this ATP binding socket, and it doesn't allows the ATP to bind to this molecule EGFR. Okay, so that's how the ATP is not able to bind, and hence the EGFR activation is stopped, and so the entire MAP kinase signaling pathway is stopped, and the proliferation of the cell stops. So the tumor progression stops, right? So this is how the medical oncologist actually gives the drug, and you stop the progression of the tumor. But this was the simplest case. I think out of all the lung carcinoma cases, this was the simplest one. But it is not always like this. So, for example, we take another case. This was a 44-year-old woman, which was a never smoker with chest pain. She had cough and dyspnea. And when he did, so this patient came to Dr. Nirmal Rawat, who is one of our collaborators. And when she came to him, and one, in the CT, there was a fairly large mass of tumor in the right lung upper lobe. So in the radiology, you can see, in the image, you can see this large tumor is there, which I have pointed with a red arrow, right? And then, he asked for Sanger sequencing to be done. So he, basically got a small biopsy out, and he sent it to a lab which did PCR, and found that there was an EGFR L858R mutation. And just like as I explained earlier, exon 19 deletion, L858R mutation is also a very typical mutation that makes EGFR constitutively active, right? So it becomes an oncogene, and it drives the cancer, right? So, so of course, he was very happy that, EGFR L858R, so I can give the patient gefitinib, and the tumor should regress. So in the A panel, this is the tumor that patient came with, and then he gave gefitinib at 250 milligrams per day, and even after 6 weeks, he didn't see any regression of tumor. Rather, there was slight progression of the disease, so the tumor became larger, as you can see in the image, right? So that was very confounding as to how this is happening. So, one thing was that earlier by Sanger sequencing, he had only tested EGFR mutation. While, if you see this signaling pathway, there are many players, right? There could be a mutation in EGFR, there could be a mutation in RAS molecule, RAF molecule. So all these things can drive the cancer. Then there are certain very different signaling molecules, just like EGFR. So, in the NCCN guidelines, all these molecules are listed. So, for example, apart from EGFR, there are ALK, ROS1, BRAF, KRAS, MET, RET, ERBP2. All these are tyrosine kinase receptors, right? So they have a growth factor which can bind to them, and then they get activated, and then they transmit the entire activation through a signaling pathway all the way to the nucleus, and then ask the cell to divide, right? So it was very possible that maybe one of the other players got into picture apart from EGFR, and that was also driving the cancer. So what he asked us to do was, why don't we sequence all these genes? So we did an NGS, or next generation sequencing, which is fairly different from simple PCR, where we looked at not just EGFR, we looked at ALK, ROS1, BRAF, KRAS, METRET, ERBB2, all the entire slew of genes. And what we found was there was another mutation which was MET exon 14 skipping mutation, right? And So this is a established oncogene. Now it becomes an established oncogene, and this mutation is known to drive cancer. So what's the mechanism? So this is the DNA, right? This is the DNA of MET gene, and you have exon 13. Then green is the exon 14, and again the blue is exon 15. So what happens is from DNA you make pre-mRNA and then you make RNA, right? And the splicing of exon, there are these splice junctions. So exon 14 basically codes for a lobe or for a domain which has to which ubiquitin ligase can bind. And when ubiquitin ligase binds to a protein, it does ubiquitination of that protein, which can be degraded by proteasomes, right? Now, what happens is certain mutations happen in the splice sites such that this entire exon 14 is removed, right? So you have exon 13 which fuses directly with exon 15 and there is no exon 14. So when you convert this into a protein, you have this transmembrane protein, but it doesn't have the domain to which ubiquitin ligase can bind. So it cannot do ubiquitination of this protein. So the degradation of this protein is slowed. And because of that, the number of MET protein in the cell membrane really increases. And that really takes up a lot of signals, growth factor signals, and drives the cells to multiply, and that leads to tumor formation. So, what to do about that? So, what happens is just like for EGFR, you have a drug called gefitinib. For MET, you have another drug which is called as capmatinib. So, what he did was he added gefitinib and capmatinib together, and after 6 weeks, he found. So, if you see the panel C, there is a dramatic reduction or regression of the tumor in the images. You can see that from B, this tumor was pretty big, and now once the capmatinib is also added to gefitinib, that really reduced, and it continued for 8 months, right? So this is a very beautiful example that how you can understand the signaling pathway. You can put specific blockers, and actually you can see the regression of tumors, and it just goes completely, right? So in case of, if you see signaling wise, EGFR stimulates both MAP kinase pathway, KRAS, BRAF, MAP kinase pathway, and also signals through the PI3K AKT mTOR pathway, and so MET also uses the same both pathways. And if you block both of them by gefitinib and capmatinib, you actually block the entire signaling, and the cell growth stops. And you can see a beautiful reduction in the tumor, right? So these were examples of how these are two cases, simple cases as to how people use the knowledge of molecular pathways in cancers, and how to block them to really manage patients' tumor and reduce the progression free, increase the progression free survival and overall survival. Now, apart from this, I also wanted to briefly talk about one more study that we are currently doing in our lab. And this is also very important because this entire thing of it's not as simple that you just take a tissue and you just sequence it, and you get a very fine beautiful sequence of all these genes lined up before you, and you can simply compare it with the normal human genome sequence, figure out which are the pathogenic mutations, and you can tell very simply, okay, these are the drugs that one should be using. It's really not that simple. So sequencing and getting very good quality data, which can be interpreted, it's a difficult job when it is done on next generation sequencers. So a couple of things that we kept finding difficult, and we tried to figure a way around, was when samples are taken from lung. So usually core biopsies are taken, and these are very thin, small amount of tissue that are taken out from the lung, and it's not without any risk. So the radiologist has to take a call as to how many cores I can take from the tumor, whether I can actually go for 13 cores or 3 cores or 2 cores. So all these things, they decide based on the location of the tumor and how old the patient is and a lot of other clinical factors. Now, once the tumor is taken out, this small tiny biopsy then goes into formalin. Then it remains in formalin for a specific period of time, and then it is put in a wax block that we call as FFP block, right? So formalin fixed, paraffin embedded. Now, once such block is formed, then it goes to the Department of Histopathology, where it is sectioned, right, and then it is stained by H&E, and the slides are seen, and the tumor is classified and staged, etc. And then, if something is left, then that goes to the molecular lab for sequencing. So when we take out the tumor tissue from these blocks, so it has already gone through a lot of savage treatments. For example, treating DNA or treating the tissue with formalin. So what formalin does is that it makes adducts between DNA and proteins, right? And once these adducts are formed, and if in the molecular lab, all the time you're using these enzymes which basically bind to DNA and slide over the DNA. But imagine that there is a railroad, and you put stones in the railroad, and then you are sliding something on the railroad, and if a stone comes, then your movement gets restricted. So the same thing happens if the adducts are formed. Your polymerase enzymes cannot slide over the DNA and cannot do their job. So a lot of things happen in the pathology lab sometimes if the tissue is not fixed by 10% buffered formalin. So let's say if it was fixed by unbuffered formalin, acidic formalin, or let's say the ideal time for fixation is 6 to 48 hours, but let's say that the tumor was taken out in the morning, and it was a Saturday or a Friday, and then the lab was closed, pathology lab was closed for a couple of days. So it keeps lying around in the formalin for a very long period of time, and that keeps degrading the DNA and RNA in the tissue, right? So when eventually we used to take out the DNA and RNA from this tissue, so we had highly degraded molecules, and getting a good quality data, NGS data or the sequencing data out of it was very, very difficult. So we tried something innovative. We used a commercial product called RNA Later. RNA Later is something, a solution that has inherent RNase inhibitors also in it, and they keep the integrity of RNA and DNA to highest levels. So we use these solutions, and we ask the radiologist to take out the core biopsy, and instead of putting it in formalin, we ask them to put it directly into RNA Later solution, right? So this was our study design, where on the left we had the control panel, where the USG guided lung tumor biopsies were taken, 2 to 6 core biopsies. They were collected in buffered formalin and fixed for approximately 12 hours, and then the FFP blocks were made in the histopathology department, and then they were shipped to us. And then we did a genomic analysis where we extracted the DNA and RNA from these tissues, and we analyzed 52 genes, right, by an NGS, next generation sequencing platform. So this was the standard process. And then the other was we tweaked our tweaked process. So we took about 1 to 4 core biopsies from the as USG guided lung tumor biopsy, and then we collected right directly into 1 ml of RNA Later solution. So no formalin in this. So it was done right there, once the tumor tissue was taken out, and it was shipped to us with just a cool pack. So we didn't freeze the sample. We just put a cool pack so that the temperature was maintained from 0 to 4 degrees. It was shipped to us, and we did the exact same NGS panel we ran over these tissues, right? So first thing first, you will see that the quality of DNA and RNA in both cases were pretty different. So in figure 1, in the left side, the DNA and RNA we isolated from, this is one of the typical cases of FFP block. Um, and this is specifically when the FFP block is not prepared properly. So if you see DNA, it is highly sheared, right? So you can see a smear out here. And if the DNA molecule size is smaller, it will run faster, right? So here in case of RNA, you will see that there is a faint band at the bottom, because it is highly sheared. So very small fragments of RNA are formed and they run faster in the agarose gel. And so we are seeing it here. Whereas compare that with RNA later, and here you can see that DNA and RNA bands are pretty high up because these are very large fragments. So their molecular weights are pretty large, and so they run very slowly, right? So this shows the quality of DNA and RNA that we extracted from both FFP block and biopsies which were taken in RNA later. Um, when we so in the process of NGS, we first prepare the libraries, right? So we amplify the DNA with specific primers, and then we add adapters and barcodes to these amplified products. And then when we run it, so we have this graph on which on the y-axis we have the counts, and on the x-axis we have the read length. So read length of in case of tissues which were taken from RNA later, we had a very high quality of DNA fragments. A lot of them were in the range which we were expecting, which is about 150 to 200 base pairs. Whereas in case of FFP block, these fragments or the amplicons, their sizes were much smaller, right? They were not. I mean, a lot of them still came out at 150, but the quality of read length was pretty good in case of RNA later, and this was the average read length in base pairs in case of FFP and RNA later, which was not very different. That the difference was only about 20 base pairs, but the quality was much better in case of RNA later. Now, this is a very crucial graph. So what we did was we took about 20 biopsies which were taken as an FFP block, and we had 14 biopsies which were taken right in RNA later, and then we performed NGS from both these sets, right? And after that, after the sequencing, we found how many of these biopsies showed a driver mutation, right? Whether there was any mutation which was targetable with a drug, right? So in case of an FFP block biopsies, about from out of 20, in 13 of them, we got targetable mutations. And in 7, we did not get any targetable mutation. But out of these 7, about 6 biopsies failed on the quality control matrix. So that means that the DNA and RNA were sheared to such an extent that when we ran NGS, we didn't get an interpretable or the quality of data which was interpretable, right? So then for these 7 patients, nothing could be told conclusively. So these 7 patients will go on chemotherapy. And out of these 13 patients can avail targeted therapy. While if you take RNA later, out of 14 patients, 11 patients we could find a targetable mutation, right? So these patients could avail hypothetically one of the targeted therapy. While only 3 patients, they did not have any targetable mutation, but they were not having targetable mutation not because their quality control matrix failed and we could not give out an interpretable data. They genuinely did not have a targetable mutation, right? So this was a very big difference between FFP block and RNA later. Now what that means is that while our change was very simple, that we just introduce an RNA later solution in the entire chain of procuring the biopsy and getting it to the lab. When you say that out of 20, in 7 the QC in 7 we could not detect driver mutation, and out of that in 6 the QC matrix failed. That means versus if you see RNA later, so what it tells us that in if you take the biopsies in RNA later, there are much higher probability that you will find a targetable mutation. Like in case of RNA later, in 78% of cases we could find a targetable mutation, and so the management of the patient will differ. Whereas in case of FFP blocks, only in 55% of the cases we could find a targetable mutation. So, in quite a few number of patients, there could have been a targetable mutation, but because they were FFP blocks and the quality of FFP blocks were poor, so the NGS data was poor and we couldn't interpret it. So even though they might have targetable mutation, there was no detection of that. So these patients eventually went on chemotherapy. So overall lifespan for these patients would have reduced versus in from patients who actually where the mutation was detected and the therapy was given, right? So it has a huge implication when it comes to the clinic. The second place where we found that the difference was there because the integrity of DNA and RNA was pretty high. We could also find a lot more passenger mutations in biopsies that were collected from in RNA later versus from FFP blocks. Now passenger mutations are, if you take a strand of DNA and if you open it up, right, and there are a couple of mutations which are driver mutations which are actually driving the cancer, but then you will also find a lot of mutations which are present which do not drive the mutation. They are just coexisting mutations or passenger mutations, but they have an important implication. So there is a matrix called as tumor mutational burden. So how many mutations you can find per megabase of the DNA. Now, if if the number of mutation is higher beyond a threshold, then such patients can respond well to immunotherapy, right? So this is the implication of that. Now, if you take RNA later versus FFP block, number of coexisting mutations, identification of coexisting mutations were much higher in RNA later, right? It was almost 3.4 folds high. So that will have an implication on tumor mutational burden calculation, and that eventually will have implication on whether the patient will respond to immunotherapy or not, right? When we looked at the type of mutation, type of driver mutation found in FFP block versus in RNA later, we did not find any difference. In both cases, we could find EGFR mutations, ALK fusions, KRAS mutations, BRAF mutations, etc., which are very established driver mutations. So, in qualitatively, there was not much difference. So, with this, I will come to the end of our talk, and I would like to acknowledge the people who have contributed to this talk. Our molecular biology laboratory, the three people who are mainstay, Khushbu, Rushvi and Smita, they do all the sequencing experiments. Then the bioinformatics is run by Nikunj. Our histopathology pathology department headed by Dr. Bhavna Mehta. She does all the pathology for the cancer tumors. We collaborate very closely with medical oncologists, and Dr. Nirmal Rawat is always involved in pretty much all of our studies. Dr. Kunal Jain, who is in American Oncology Institute, and Dr. Davinder Paul in American Oncology Institute again. So I'm very thankful to all the collaborators and to our lab people. And thank you once again to Human Genetic Unit, Faculty of Medicine, and Human Genetic Society for such generous invitation for a talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddharth, for that excellent and really elaborate and comprehensive presentation. So I would like to open the floor now for questions. We have about 10 more minutes. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself, unmute your mic and ask the question and direct it to Dr. Siddharth.
Yeah, please ask. If any questions which is clinical, non-clinical. Let's see. I mean, if I can't promise I can answer all the questions, but whatever is possible with me. If you have a method-based question, also please go ahead and ask.
Okay, I would just like to make a comment. I think it's interesting to see your findings, the comparison between the FFPE and the RNA later samples. No, I mean, because we've been having that same issue of, having very poor quality DNA, which is not,
Yeah,
suitable for NGS analysis from the
yeah,
FFP
yeah.
blocks because of the degradation. So this collecting the samples in RNA later and then getting a better yield is something, that one
Yeah.
should
So,
seriously consider, I think,
the one thing I really liked about this method was that, it's very apt for developing countries like Sri Lanka and India, because, maintaining a cold chain is very difficult in our countries. Like if you ask somebody to maintain, to keep the tissue frozen, right, from 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 Galle to Colombo, that's not easy, and the cost will really spiral if you want to transport such. But if you put it in RNA later, you don't have to really freeze it. You can just keep it at 0 to 4 degrees. So you can put couple of cool packs in it and you can ship it, and that uh, really saves cost also, because all the tests in our countries, they're also very cost sensitive. So that way I really liked, and now we have a data of about 60 to 70 patients. This was an earlier analysis that I showed, where we had only 14 patients, which where the tissue was taken in RNA later. Now we have much larger pool, so we are working on that, and we'll soon publish it. And I think this can really bring a big change in bringing in the patients where we can find a targetable mutation, which normally they might have gone for, like, okay, no mutation found because the quality of data was poor. So it can be a it can make a big difference in their in the way they are managed, their tumors are managed.
Okay, Dr. Siddha, there's a question in the chat box. I'll just read
Hmm.
it out. It says, when biopsies collected in RNA later, how will you be sure of tumor cells are present?
Yeah, so that is a caveat, right? So that is definitely a caveat, that if you do not go for histopathology, then how you will figure out. So usually, as of now, what we are doing is we are going for patients which are generally relapsed. So they are already primary tumors were taken and they were already treated, and then they relapsed after the first line of treatment, right? So in the relapsed patient, they already know that the patient had, let's say, NSCLC, adenocarcinoma, and all, but still it is not 100% sure that the patient, the cancers, when the radiologist poked in, he or she actually took out the right portion, right? But in our we have a very low amount of data as of now, but what we have seen is that in that pool, we get very high proportion, right? Where we are actually able to detect a targetable mutation. Now, this is a catch-20 situation, right? So there is no end to this argument, because if you take these tiny biopsies through entire formalin fixation FFP block, then you lose out on the content and the test fails, right? So doing everything together is a bit it is a bit of a difficult issue. It's not that simple. So one way out, which is a possible way out, which I see, is we can take these biopsies, and then we can freeze these biopsies, and we can do a histopathology on the frozen sections, right? And once the pathology is done on the frozen section, immediately the rest of the part is taken, and it can be analyzed in the molecular lab. But again, because these biopsies are so tiny, if you shave off a certain piece of biopsy, then what is the guarantee that the rest of the piece had the cancer cells? So I think it's not very easy to answer this dilemma, but one has to first prove, according to me, that the RNA later actually gives a better results, and then we can go about trying to incorporate this, how to answer this lacuna, that but how to figure out whether the biopsy had cancer cells or not. So I think it in the second stage we can try to incorporate, we'll have to think about how to incorporate that part also. I hope that answered the question. Otherwise, please ask if there is any. sub-question to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Right. Thank you. So if there are no other questions, I would like to bring this session to a conclusion. Once more, I would like to thank Dr. Siddharth for the time and contributions you have made to us this webinar. And I would like to thank Dr. Chamik also from HISL for the support extended towards conducting this event. And thanks to all the participants who, were keenly engaged from the beginning. Thank you for participating. Just be informed that a recorded version of this webinar will be available at the Human Genetics Society website. So if you go to www.humangeneticsociety.lk, all the webinars are there. The previous ones plus the current and the upcoming ones will be uploaded. So you can always access them at any time once they are uploaded. So on that note, sorry?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a point that, we are going to have 2 more talks. So if you found there was anything lacking, or if you wanted to change the format in any which way, or if you wanted the talk to be taken in a different way, just let Dr. Nirmala know. So, I can make amends for the next talk.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, you can always send the feedback to our email. It's there on the flyer. Okay, so the next session will be in 2 weeks' time. That will be on the 25th of November, same time. You don't need to register again. You can use the same link to join the webinar that you used for this event. And that will be on colorectal cancers. So we look forward to meeting with Dr. Siddharth again in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Siddharth.
sir.
And
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you
This
so
is
much.
very useful
thank you.
session.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks.